All right, so on the rule of two, which we've been sort of slogging through, we've got a couple of items up. The discussions of using note else sections. We talked a little bit about last week. Last week, we also merged the draft PR for distinguishing between artifact ID types in the Gitbom document. There is an outstanding PR for the file system persistence, and there's also an outstanding PR there for from minor fixes. Jeremy had a whole bunch of comments, and some of them I missed in passing on the draft PR, so I opened a secondary PR to address some of them. And then we also have, outside of the rule of two, we have to embed or not to embed. That is the question in terms of the hash mode stuff that Young Kui had suggested last week. Do folks have any preferences in terms of the order with which we address these matters?
I'll speak up. The topic of distinguishing between artifact ID types in Gitbom docs is interesting, and I'm continuing to have that conversation in other forums with folks. So you want to start there?
Sure. So last week we had merged the draft PR, which actually, last week we had merged the draft PR, which means that we no longer have to look at the PR per se, but it'll get me to the repo. And currently in the spec, effectively what it comes down to is we sort of talk through the normal sorts of things in the spec. When we talk about artifact identifier types in terms of the gitoids, and we basically say all subsequent references to metaphor identifier types in this document should be interpreted to mean gitoid, blob SHA-1 and gitoid blob SHA-256. And then when we talk about going through, we have a Gitbom document header. So the first line of the Gitbom document is the type for that document. So new line terminated. And then when you deal with the child document records, effectively they're the same. It's just that they imply from the header which artifact type you're dealing with. So it was a relatively simple change. It primarily consists of adding the header to the Gitbom document file so that you can actually find it. Does that refresh your memory a bit with that?
It does. I don't remember where we landed with respect to, let me start over. If a child artifact would be represented by blob artifact ID, Gitbom identifier, so it'll be gitoid blob SHA-1 or SHA-256. I think we had stated that we shouldn't be mixing those blob types, but with this being expressly listed there, you actually could.
So but the only place you reference the type is in the header.
So this is only in the top line of that.
Right. And the artifact ID and the Gitbom ID must both be the artifact type declared in the Gitbom document header.
Not for every one of them. Yeah, that we might want to make that a little bit clearer here.
Yep.
Thing that I would also find helpful is example docs or examples to say this is what the file would look like.
Yep, that's a good idea. And also anti-examples. This will never happen.
Ooh, and fuzzy examples. Should this happen or not? Sorry. Coming from a testing meeting.
So ideally, I would say that you want to actually avoid fuzzy examples in the spec. But if you find fuzzy examples, they should be considered probably bugs. So at least in the spec. Okay, so take a note on that. The other piece of this got broken off into a separate PR on FS persistence. And let me stick the link into the chat for folks if you want to follow along at home and comment. And just to do a quick scan through it, through the current proposal for that. Second. The current proposal is we have a separate Annex A file for Gitbom document persistence by a build tool to its local file system. And effectively, it effectively says, if the Gitbom persists to a local file system, then the build tool should write out the Gitbom document to the object subdirectory of the Gitbom directory with the artifact ID type URI, with prefix with the colons replaced by slashes, and then the normal breakdown of the Gitbom identifier into the first two characters that are remaining. And then there was a suggestion to indicate that, it's lowercase hexadecimal with leading zero. It was, I'm sorry, not suppressed. That should be not suppressed. Let me fix that immediately because that could slip through. But I'll fix that shortly.
Do you want me to put in a change there while you're?
Oh, a suggestion there would be fantastic. Thank you. Yes. Leading zero is not suppressed. So for example, the example here is the Gitbom directory here is .adg for artifact dependency graph /objects, and then gitoid blob SHA-1, and then the breakdown of the particular piece. Now, I know that there is an outstanding conversation with Ava about this part of the structure, the gitoid blob SHA-1 piece. So I want to make sure we do come back to that, but it may be more appropriate to come back to that when Ava is returned, which I think is next week. Make sense so far?
Not sure what Ava's perspective was there, so I'm sure we'll come back to it. But if this is already listed under .adg, it's already a Gitbom structured part. A place to store Gitbom information. Is it repetitive to keep the gitoid there?
So the point being, and this is actually literally where the conversation with Ava was going, is whether we wish to be precise in specifying the type of the identifier or not. My tendency is towards precision, and also towards flexibility. Because if, for example, 18 months from now, someone comes up with something that's better than Git, and in the next 5 years, it burns through the ecosystem until Git is like Subversion. I don't want us to have welded in a way that we can't transition. Does that make sense?
And so to be precise is to use the same URI that we use with slashes instead of colons, and therefore gitoid /blob /SHA-1.
That's the argument that I make. Doesn't make me right or wrong. It just makes me somebody with an opinion. Ava has a differing view on this, and other people are welcome to have a differing view on this.
I understand where you got to, and that's really the question I was getting at. So we'll pick it up when Ava's back.
Perfect. Cool. The other thing I added here was I added this section because of the conversation with Young-Kui about what he was calling, I think, hash mode. Is that correct, Young-Kui? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, that's right.
And in the hash mode stuff, one of the things that struck me about that is in Young-Kui's proposal, and we can get to that shortly and further down in the meeting, he was suggesting that we have a mode where the build tool could be optionally told, please don't embed the artifact ID. Because, for example, I may be dealing with an environment where I don't expect the output to vary from something I've compiled before Gitbom existed, but I'd like to capture the Gitbom data. As an option, I absolutely see the value in this. I still think that vetting into the objects is a better default behavior, but as an option, I see the value in this. But as part of this, Young-Kui was suggesting persisting a map between the artifact IDs themselves and the Gitbom documents. And so I just took a first pass at how we might represent this as an optional thing the tool could do using symlinks, because symlinks tend to be, when you sort of think through things that everybody can work with, they tend to be fairly flexible and everyone can work with them. And so the basic idea here was have a directory A2G under the Gitbom directory for artifact to graph, and then just have the same scheme that we use for Gitbom stuff, to use the artifact identifier and have that as a symlink pointing to the Gitbom document. And I just realized you need a couple of relative redirects here in this. One second. It's going to be, I'll just put a note here. And I gave an example here below. And again, this example will also need to be corrected. But the basic idea is that you have something that looks like, instead of under objects under artifact to graph, that still has the prefix and then the identifier, but is actually a symlink pointing to a Gitbom document.
So if someone has no knowledge and they look at these two directories, one is ADG objects and the other is ADG A2G. Even if they knew A2G means artifact to graph, does objects represent the artifacts or the graph?
This represents the artifact, and it's pointing to the graph.
So it might be worthwhile to state .adg/artifact/gitoid, because while A2G, I understand the semantic meaning, it might be clearer for folks to disambiguate between the two.
Cool. Could you drop a comment to that effect?
Will do.
Perfect. That's a good point. Other thoughts from folks? Okay, the next section was about the build tool persistence of metadata. I've incorporated some of the comments that Jeremy had made here. One of the points that Jeremy made was that he brought up was around tool naming, and what happens if you have tools that share common metadata between them, right? If someone agrees to common metadata. And so where this had previously been the suggestion you put things in the Gitbom dir /metadata/tool name, here I've renamed it context, because for metadata that's specific to a particular tool, context should be a name uniquely associated with the build tool, like LLVM or GCC. And that build tool should, please note, should in this context means it's recommended, report their selection of context subdirectory name to the Gitbom spec so we can keep a list, so people can hopefully avoid colliding with each other. But again, that's a should, not a must. Metadata persisted by multiple build tools in the same way should, again, recommendation, not requirement, write a specification for that metadata. Such specs must include the context used for that metadata. And such specs should be reported to the Gitbom, again, recommended spec for inclusion in a list of, to preclude context collision. So essentially, if you're a build tool and you want to go lay claim to LLVM, great, please tell us that's what you're using. If you're a couple of build tools working together on some common metadata and you'd like to write a spec for some common metadata and you want to call your common metadata foo, that's great. It would be great if you told us so that the other person who decides to call it foo will not. Make sense so far? Awesome. And then subdirectory structure, file naming, and file schema below that point are at the discretion of the build tool for that specific metadata or the metadata spec for common metadata.
So just going back to 36 for a minute, I'm thinking about the way that it's done in Java land, which is packages are named based on the reversal of their domain. So it'd be like com or io.sneak.something something.
Sure.
And that's a pretty cheap and easy way of avoiding name collisions.
If you have associated domain names necessarily. Basically it presumes that you have ownership of a domain name. And a lot of times people do, but not always.
It's a pure recommendation in Java land, but it's kind of, it's
definitely the way it's done, no question.
Yeah. So, if there's a way of basically saying choose an identifier that's associated with your org, for example, domain name or something else, that creates the nice quick disambiguation.
Okay. No, that's an interesting idea.
Never mind. I'm beating a very small pony with a very large mallet. I'll shut up now. Let's move on.
No. I mean, I like the suggestions, and do please feel free to leave that comment for further discussion there.
Okay.
But there are lots of interesting ways to do it. I think the minimal thing that I was getting here was to make sure that I captured in a reasonable way Jeremy's point about exactly how are you avoiding collision on this stuff.
So I'm just going to take this in a similar direction. So the way that DVP is suggesting is, hey, do it based on the organization. Another way we could think about this is, will there be other data besides build tool metadata? And so do we need to think about a Gitbom dir/build metadata versus other metadata? Or are there other ways that we should be organizing this?
It's an interesting question. The interesting question is effectively, do we want to segregate build tool metadata from other kinds of metadata that's been persisted to the file system? That's interesting, because and I've been so focused on build tools, it hadn't occurred to me one way or the other. But I think you're basically sort of getting into things like, do we necessarily want to persist an SPDX document here as metadata that has references? My off the cuff thought on that is that the space around common metadata, or around other metadata specs, is sufficiently broad that you could say just have an SPDX subdirectory under metadata and just say, look, if you go to whatever kind of a thing you are, if you're going to persist SPDX stuff that references this tool, here's a good place for you in metadata where you won't conflict with things.
So I want to be clear here as well. Is this for referencing the actual metadata that would be like in the scenario SPDX, or would this be only the Gitbom metadata that's been generated for others to consume as we specify in the specification?
So my thinking so far, and I'm open to broadening it very much so, was that if I am a build tool and I want to go write out a bunch of information, we would like that information to sort of be cleanly laid out in a way where build tools won't stomp each other, because I expect many people to point to one big giant directory structure in the sky. And that was why my thought was that you wouldn't want to have that was my thought about why you would want to basically be able to segregate by build tools and that kind of stuff into a context for that metadata. I don't expect people will necessarily publish this tree in terms of just like tarring the whole thing up and throwing the tarball out. I would expect folks to munge this into what they publish. So I'd not been thinking about this in terms of a publication spec, but more in terms of a persistence spec, if that makes sense.
Yeah, because the thing that worries me is if we put in a whole bunch of different directories, that yes, it does make things cleaner, that we know which tool generated what, and that there's less likely for there to be any contention in those directories, as in, like, I could literally say this tool is only allowed to modify the SPDX directory because that's all it's been entitled to do, and so it could not inject things into other things. So there is value in the separation. But at the same time, that means that if I have another tool that's going to consume things from a build process, from SPDX, from a code scanner, et cetera, and each of these ends up in a different directory, then that means is that I no longer have one place to look. I now have multiple places that I then have to go and query in order to determine whether or not that thing is in my my Gitbom path, for lack of a better phrase.
Well, but I mean,
that increases the complexity.
But when it comes to metadata, I expect most of the metadata at first is going to be bespoke to the particular tool, right? Because there's a question of the file naming, file subdirectory structures, and file schemas for that metadata. And so, for example, if you were going to go output a whole bunch of stuff that was mapping from Gitbom data to file names, for example, you're going to dump it all into a JSON file. You know, if you were going to go do that, effectively, you would need to understand the context so you knew what the file format was for the metadata, if that makes sense. Did that answer your question at all, or am I completely off track?
So I didn't quite follow the last part of it, Ed, but the way that I think about this is there continues to be a conversation about, well, how does SBOM relate to build tool data, and how might you represent the composition of a build infrastructure related to the composition of the artifact? And so what I think we should aim for is flexibility within the metadata folder so that we contain it all in this one directory, figure out how to structure that appropriately so that some of this data can be persisted to then be consumed by another tool that say picks it up and puts it into the right format for Salsa, for SPDX, for that next scanner that wants to ingest it, for whatever that next thing is.
Yeah, no, I mean that's absolutely true, and that's part of where my thinking was going with context. But I'm open to other ways to approach that, because I do expect whatever metadata we have, whatever the consumer is for that metadata, it needs to understand the type of metadata, and I don't expect tools to understand all types of metadata. That would be kind of unreasonable, or consuming tools to understand all types, and so they would need to have a way to figure out the kinds of metadata they understand how to interpret.
Yeah, so maybe we just specify a couple examples that we think might stick early on for a couple specific build tools and for a couple common formats like SBOM formats, and then leave it at that for now.
So,
Yep.
Just a quick question, comment. So when you say context, I understand that different build tools can output different kinds of metadata, but should there be any recommended or must include metadata that's common for all the tools that'll be under the standard? I mean, in one, like Gitbom data and customized metadata in different directories, so that a tool that wants to understand the metadata need not can look for a common place for the standard things and not have to learn how the metadata is output by different build tools.
Yeah, I think that's intensely useful. That's part of why there was essentially the whole paragraph here in 36 about metadata persisted by multiple build tools in the same way. Should write a specification for that metadata, effectively saying you can absolutely have downstream specifications for metadata that make sense for build tools, and then you drive for their adoption with things.
So the context is optional? Is that?
No, the context portion of the directory is not optional. If you're outputting metadata, it should be in a particular kind of context. But say for example that there's a group that goes off and writes a spec for file to artifact ID and file to Gitbom document metadata, right? They would select a context name to represent themselves, which is the subdirectory they put their result under. And then any build tool that was wanting to adopt that metadata spec could do so and output to that directory.
So that is custom, right? That is custom metadata by whatever tools they're free to. So my question is, where is the does the Gitbom spec recommend or mandate a set of file system? I think probably everybody would want it. So can that be put as a common
Well, that's absolutely open to discussion, but in the interest of being able to that's absolutely open to discussion. In fact, to a certain degree, the whole artifact to graph mapping stuff that I suggested is in some sense sort of capturing a particular kind of mandated metadata. Do keep in mind, we want to keep the first pass on doing this for build tools ultra simple though. And so I would suggest that the way to go about this is, number one, in downstream specs on these things, like take the example of file, the file name mapping, right? You could put that together and then recommend that all build tools that are going to do file name mapping, please use the file name mapping spec. But that's a downstream thing. If I'm a build tool, it doesn't require that my build tool do file name mapping at all. It's just if I'm going to do it, it recommends that you do it using the common file name mapping spec. Does that make sense?
Yeah, but I was just wondering what would be the if there is a separate directory, or where does that common metadata, where that information would be persisted? Because it says metadata slash context, and so I can have metadata slash LLVM slash GCC, but where does that common?
Right. So metadata persisted by multiple build tools. Basically, when you write your specification, you should specify what your context is for that common metadata, right? So if I'm file to artifact mapping, right, maybe I pick a particular directory name like file to artifact as my context. And then any build tool would write into file to context. Does that make sense? How can I make that clearer here? Because I'm often terrible at that.
Yeah, maybe an example of what a context is here. Is the context the type of metadata, or context a build tool, like the context of a build tool? That was where I had the confusion.
Got it. No, that's actually a good point. Do folks have? And I sort of commented that this was related to some stuff that Jeremy had called out. And then the build selection, tool selection of the Gitbom directory, I think is the same as it was before. If you've got a non-empty environment variable Gitbom dir, take that. Otherwise, take a build flag. Otherwise, we have some default directory name. Is there anything else on this one that folks would like to go over? Looks like we're capturing a lot of good conversational bits as well. Thank you for the suggestion, Jeff. That's hugely helpful. And obviously, it sounds like more examples than anti-examples are definitely needed.
Yeah, making progress. Thanks, Ed.
Excellent. So, awesome. So do we want to go to, so what do we want to go to next? We've gone through the distinguishing Gitbom ID type stuff. Or actually, let's finish up with the minor fixes to the PR really quickly, because I think this is fairly straightforward. Basically, Jeremy had pointed out that we have not been terribly explicit about character encoding in the Gitbom document, and suggested that we indicate that it's all in ASCII and make extremely clear that /n is the new line character, not the delimiter of the platform. Funny story there, by the way. You know how HTTP says that you should end with CRLF, but you must accept either CR or LF? I literally, when I was working on Wireshark, we had code in there to deal with people who were doing LFCR, because that's how perverse the world is. Okay. So do we want to go talk about notes in ELF sections next, or the to embed or not to embed question?
Well, the notes section is a relatively smaller topic than the other one.
Okay.
So for the notes section, I think we are in agreement with all the comments. All the other comments have been resolved except for the one open topic of what
Would
should
you like-
go into the embedded, what should go into the content of the section. Should it be the gitoid or the URI or anything
So
else?
do you want to share?
I think this is good. This is the only one that is not resolved. Everything else I've resolved.
There's another issue you mentioned for the program bits versus node type in the intermediate.o files. Right.
So I was just waiting for the GCC implementation to complete before I actually, because I thought we'll spend a little bit more time to see if it's possible at all, and then bring it come back to the spec.
Sure. So I have done some experiments using the bin utility tool, the OBJ copy tool, to do the experiment. So I successfully used OBJ copy to insert a node type ELF section into the intermediate.o file. Also, when linking that .o into the executable, it works actually. Both GC and clone, they successfully just accept.
Yes. I mean, if you're able to create the section of type SHT note, then everything will work. So I think Veslav had some challenge in trying to create a note section from within GCC, but maybe I don't know, we have exhausted all the possibilities and ruled out whether it can be done or not. So I was just waiting on that information before we bring something to spec. That's not
sure.
Sure.
Let's wait for it. But at least for the linking part, I think it's fine. I don't know, we can insert into the .o, the node section.
Yes.
Okay.
But for Clang LLVM, I'm able to do it. So it's I mean, I figured that it's just the logistics of trying to understand how to do it than whether it's possible or not. But
okay, good.
So if you don't mind, let me do a quick run through just to refresh folks' memory on this topic. So this is about persisting the using a note field. And notes is a standard field type that gets used for lots of different purposes. And it basically has a name and what they call a name, a type, and what they call a description. So the name is think of it as a namespace really for your types. So we could use something like Gitbom. The description is the data, and then the type is a 4-byte field that indicates what type you are within that namespace. And I think there were two things, if I recall, that came up in the course of discussion around this. No, I'm sorry, you're right. It was in the course of discussion around this, we had the question of whether or not to use types and then just stick the hash values in as binary, or whether to stick the URI in as a string.
Are you looking for a comment on that, or is that really just bringing folks up to speed on what we had discussed?
That was really just bringing folks up to speed.
Currently, it records just the hash, right? So there were suggestions that why not the URI? So that's where we stopped last time.
Yeah.
So just letting the URI will be much longer, right, than the hex file. It will be maybe bloat at least doubled, right? And then should be tripled, I think, from 100 to 300 bytes, I think, for the overhead for each checksum like that, I think.
And the question is, can the URI be constructed with this information if needed, so we don't have to embed additional information?
So
well, I think it could be constructed because for at least the known types, each known type maps directly to a URI prefix, right? So NT gitoid blob SHA-1 maps to gitoid : blob : SHA-1. And anyone who's doing a custom type in the range reserved for custom types could do likewise with their mapping of their type to whatever the prefix is.
Yeah, so I was just questioning what is the additional value to, what is the value to providing that additional information? So this will be like this will make the section compact, but if there are more opinions on that, we can discuss it now.
So right now, you guys are leaning towards the type being 0x1 or 0x2, because that's what's defined. And in the future, should a new type be defined, we just add 0x3.
Yes, it needs to get added to that enum, yes.
And my interpretation of this is that the gitoid blob SHA-1 could also be added as a URI in the descriptor field. Is that another thing you've considered, or?
So the descriptor currently will only contain the hash, the SHA-1, SHA-256 hash. If there's really not much value in adding more information in that, because the type of that is going to clearly tell you whether the hash is SHA-1 type or 256 or something else. So if we explicitly append like SHA-1, it'll be just like superfluous information. That's it.
So if you use, for example, type 0, and use that as special node type, and then in the description field, you can just have a concatenated list of URI, right? Because each URI already carries a SHA-1, SHA-256 type, right?
Yeah, I think what you're suggesting is that if we were to go the URI route, then we wouldn't need to use the type for anything. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right.
Okay. But it would still be quite a bit larger, and I don't think it would carry any more semantic information. I think it also puts the, particularly for folks who are building build tools, my sense is, and Vladislav, you can let me know this, that parsing a URI is somewhat less comfortable than doing a mapping of a byte structure out of a thing, where you say, okay, we'll map this out to the loads byte structure, and then we've got a type, and we can go ahead and match against the type and know what we're doing.
I mean, there is a field reserved for the type that you can make use of. Now we are saying we'll put that in the string and parse the string and make sense out of it. So it's just writing more code, but we're not making use of the type field that's been reserved for that purpose to indicate what is the type of data that you're writing.
Yep. So in the interest of time, especially since I think the major proponent of URIs was Dave Pollock, who has had to drop off the call. Oh. I would suggest that we move on to the remaining issue, which is Youngkui's issue about embedding or not embedding. Do you want to speak to this, Youngkui?
Yeah, sure. So this record hash mode to support that. But I think your idea of using the symlink, it also can, optionally disable the embedding, right? It supports that too. So I think the only difference of this mode, record hash mode, versus using symlink to record the A to G mapping, is that this mode, can be more flexible, right? Because at build time, we only record the hash. We don't generate any A to G, those Gitbom document, not the mapping, right? So that it's flexible later for us to use whatever algorithm to generate the mapping. So that's one thing I think that's different.
Could you say more about that?
It's just, for example, for the linking step, right? So if two vendors or two they can think that for the linking, the dependency, one vendor think we don't need the .so as a dependency at linking time. The other think we do need that. So if you're using this mode, it's flexible for different vendor to pick different algorithm to generate the dependency, right? It's very flexible.
So I think we have an interesting question that we should probably raise in the next call about .SOs as linking dependencies and where they should sort of fall into things. But I don't actually think we want a world where different vendors are making different choices about questions of that nature, right?
Okay.
I think we want a world where the question. So for those of you, for the rest of the call, it turns out that when you are using a tool like LD or LDD, it is pulling in a bunch of .o files. It may be pulling things out of .a files to statically link in, but it may also include in its internal notion that it has some .so files, but it's not really linking the .so files. It's copying some symbols in from the .so files. The .so files are not actually linked until runtime. And so this raises an interesting question as to, do you include the .so files that were present at build time as dependencies, even though not a lick of code from them may actually be running your system? Or do you want to include the .sos that are actually dynamically linked at runtime as being dependencies of your software? However we resolve that issue, I think we should probably resolve it one way. I happen to have opinions, but I don't want to, I want to leave space for other people to express those opinions as well. But I don't think it's a good world where people are making different decisions about that. Now, Jeff, I see you have something to say, and you're closer to the pointy end of the stick on this. So I'm curious your thoughts.
I'm curious. I wanted to ask a clarifying question. Is it really an or? There could be people who want to understand both scenarios.
Well, so let's talk about what actually is involved with the .sos that are present at build time. And Bharathi, I'm relying on you and Vajislav to keep me honest. Right, at build time, effectively what's happening is the linker is looking for some symbol related information to make sure that there exists some implementation that does this, and that does the thing, right? That there is some implementation somewhere at some point, so it can construct its internal symbol tables. It's not copying any code at all from the .so. So nothing from the .so actually that's present at build time ever runs on your system. The only code that actually ever runs on your system is the code that comes from the .so that is linked at runtime by the dynamic linker. And so I'm a bit challenged to see the value in including the .so artifact at the linking step of the tree, because it would result in situations where, for example, the person who built this had an old version of glibc that is API compatible, but has known vulnerabilities in it. So there's a known set of vulnerabilities on the build server, wherever it may have been built, but they're not present in the system you're running it on. Do you want that to come up for that executable every time as having a potential vulnerability, even though it absolutely does not contain that vulnerability and can't contain that vulnerability? Or do you want to, or not, I guess is sort of my thinking on the question.
So, yeah, the question is whether we need to filter these out or not. From the build tools perspective, any file that is opened during the compilation or linking step is considered as a dependency. So that is why it is listing all these, because it is opening that shared object file to collect some symbol information or whatever that is needed. So when it's compiling or linking, the moment a file is open, that is counted as a dependency. So we will have to, I agree that there is no code that gets pulled in. So that definition of dependency that we define will be, I think, important as well in the spec document.
And yet the build would fail if those symbols weren't pulled.
Yes.
Right. And so it is still a dependency. It's
needed, yes.
Which then could persist a vulnerability down the line, to Ed's point.
So from a reproducible build perspective, I don't know if that'll count as
the
something as
reproducible
needed
build
information.
I mean there is no potential vulnerability downstream from this because there is no code that's copied in. Likewise, there are no licensing issues as a generic matter downstream from this. It would be, those licensing issues would occur at runtime, or would be coming in from headers anyway because of the declarations, right? So if you had a licensing issue, it would be coming in when you were pulling in the headers because the declarations would be coming in. So I don't think it adds anything. I don't think including the datos at linking step adds anything useful, to the system. But I think we may want to capture that for a topic for a future meeting. But again, yeah.
So I think that's not a big problem. Yeah. The other issue is that for example, a third-party .a file, for example, we have a libhello.a, that's third-party, right? We're linking that in. But at that time, we're doing the build, right? We don't have any Gitbom information for that .a file. So, so when you generate the Gitbom for other example using that .a, right? You are forced to use the empty BOM for that. So you're generating one fixed Git OID for your example. But then later that third party, they give you the Gitbom ID for that .a. Then you have no way to revise or update your Gitbom document unless you rebuild everything. But if you just record using the record mode, then it's easy for you to just rerun the post-processing script. Then you update your whole Gitbom tree. So that's very convenient.
No, as a tooling matter, as a tooling matter, absolutely. And so in my mind, effectively, what you want to make sure is that you've persisted sufficient data to support the use case you're describing, Youngkui. But I think that sufficient data is persisted that if you've got the artifact to graph mappings and you've got the Gitbom documents that were generated, I think that gives you the necessary information if you want to do something like that. Is that correct?
Yeah, I want that powerful feature. I think that's very useful for.
I can absolutely see use cases for that, and so this is what I sort of commented here. I think the crux at the end is, can a tool optionally support a mode to turn off embedding? Can you sort of say, okay, I'm going to set the correct thing that says don't embed the artifact IDs? I think gets you to where you need to go. But we are running up against time.
Yeah, even if you don't embed, right? If you generate the Gitbom document at build time, then you lose this flexibility to update your Gitbom ID later, right?
No, I mean, as long as you have the A to G mappings, you can do the post processing. I'm pretty sure you can go do the post processing you want to do.
Sure. Yeah, you can also do another post processing. Yeah. So, no, but you don't record the original raw information, so you kind of lose that.
You should be able to if you've got the Gitbom doc. We'll take it offline, but I think if
let me see.
If you record the Gitbom documents in the mapping, you should be able to go do the post processing you want to do. Anyway, there may be other things you may want to do from a tooling perspective completely, but let's take that offline. Is there anything else anybody wanted to talk about in this call? Because we're running up against time.
Yep. Yeah, very good. Thanks.